A shocking encounter between Denzel Washington and Kash Patel goes viral. A stunning confrontation between acclaimed actor and public advocate Denzel Washington and former National Security Advisor Kash Patel has gone viral. During a high-profile appearance at the National Forum on Public Integrity in Washington, D.C., an alleged insult from Patel triggered a moment that stunned the room and flipped the narrative in seconds. What began as a calm morning filled with handshakes, speeches, and polite applause quickly descended into something unforgettable. The forum, meant to promote unity and accountability in government, drew senators, military leaders, civil rights figures, and a sea of press. Denzel Washington entered with quiet confidence, dressed in a tailored Navy suit. Whispers of admiration followed him down the aisle, not for celebrity, but for his recent work advocating for veterans and whistleblowers. On the opposite side of the stage stood Kash Patel, grinning tightly, his eyes fixed on Denzel with something darker than rivalry. As the moderator invited both men to step forward for a photo op symbolizing bipartisan resolve, Patel leaned in and hissed, just loud enough for Denzel to hear. "Still playing the people's hero, huh? Some of us actually served." Denzel paused, just for a beat. The room hadn't heard it, but he had. His eyes locked onto Patel's, calm but cutting. With cameras rolling and the room hanging on the moment, Denzel turned slightly and with a composed voice that cut through the silence said, "At least I never forged the president's signature to rob this country blind." The crowd gasped. The moderators froze. Every head turned toward the stage. Pens dropped. Silence fell like a curtain. Kash Patel blinked, clearly not expecting that. His smirk faltered. Denzel stepped to the podium, voice smooth and steady. "I didn't come here to trade insults. I came here to represent the forgotten with dignity." He paused, then added firmly, "But dignity isn't weakness, and silence is not consent." A wave of applause erupted from one side of the room, startled, emotional. Patel's smile cracked as he fumbled to maintain composure. A few of his allies clapped out of reflex, unsure of what to do. It was too late. The moment had already gone viral. Hashtags like #Denzel Strikes Back and #The Truth Speaks dominated every platform. The press pool had captured everything. As Patel leaned toward a staffer and whispered, "Cut his mic if he keeps going," the microphone betrayed him, capturing the words live. Denzel took a slow breath, unshaken. "I could have let that comment slide," he said, "but I've been quiet for too long." The room leaned in. His voice was low but resolute. "I've seen things. I've kept silent out of respect. But today I speak, because truth has waited long enough." He turned slightly. While the president struggled with cognition, Kash Patel and his allies used his auto pen to push billions of dollars in fake contracts, lined up for their friends, not the American people. Gasps rippled across the audience. Security shifted. Someone dropped a water bottle. From his inner coat pocket, Denzel pulled out a folded document. "This contract, right here, signed it without the president's awareness, funneled $900,000 overseas for services never rendered." Patel's face drained of color. His staff frantically gestured to cut the stream. But it was too late. The footage was already clipped, downloaded, and shared worldwide. An elderly woman in the audience whispered tearfully, "He's telling the truth." And for the first time in years, America didn't see just a Hollywood actor. They saw a man who had been betrayed and who was finally fighting back. The fallout begins. A nation reacts to Denzel Washington's revelation. By midday, every major news network scrambled to catch up. The clip of Denzel Washington's on-stage takedown of Kash Patel looped on cable, streaming apps, and headlines. America was split. Some called it dramatic, others called it disrespectful. But millions more called it something else. Brave. A retired nurse in Ohio posted, "I used to think Denzel was just another celebrity. Not anymore. He stood up, not for himself, but for the truth." A truck driver in Texas wrote, "He said what we've all felt for years. Someone's been lying to us, and now we know who." Inside the forum hall, chaos brewed. Patel's team scrambled to draft a vague statement claiming Denzel had misinterpreted a private remark. But the damage was done. Denzel remained seated on stage, quiet but firm, his silence more commanding than any apology Patel's team could manufacture. Behind the curtain, a staffer leaned in and asked quietly, "Do you want to respond again?" Denzel shook his head. "I already did." He knew what was coming now: investigations, subpoenas, reporters digging through contracts, comparing signatures. What he didn't anticipate were the tears, coming not from outrage, but from a sense of release. People, especially veterans and ordinary citizens, suddenly saw more than just a famous actor. They saw a man willing to put everything on the line. Meanwhile, in a back hallway, Kash Patel slammed his palms against a table in the green room. "He humiliated me. This was planned." But he wasn't sure. Denzel wasn't known for stunts or cheap shots. He was known for dignity. That's what made it sting even more. A security officer approached Denzel backstage holding a tablet. "You need to see this." On screen, a live leak from X, formerly Twitter. An anonymous account had just posted a document, a contract 2 years old bearing President Biden's digital signature, previously unseen by the public. The funds, $780,000, had been funneled to a Ukrainian consulting firm linked to Patel's former business partner. Denzel recognized the connection instantly. He exhaled slowly. "The truth is moving on its own now," he said softly. This was never about revenge. Denzel had never needed a spotlight. He needed justice. But now, truth had gained momentum he hadn't even planned for. Back on stage, Denzel stood again, facing the crowd. "I don't need to raise my voice. Truth doesn't scream, it resonates." He paused, scanning the audience. "For years I've been silent, called names, dismissed, laughed at. Not because I was weak, but because I knew my moment hadn't come." Then turning toward Kash Patel, now pale and motionless, he added, "But when a man who betrayed his oath calls me a fraud, I have to speak." His voice sharpened. While the commander-in-chief struggled with clarity, "You signed papers with his name. You didn't just mock me. You exploited him." The hall fell still. Then, an elderly veteran rose slowly, saluted, and said in a trembling voice, "We see you now, sir, and we thank you." Denzel placed his hand over his chest. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about betrayal, dignity, truth. For the first time that day, Kash Patel sank into his seat, silent, powerless, and exposed. And still the news didn't sleep. Within the hour, the leaked contract hit every phone screen in America. Teenagers on TikTok reenacted Denzel's powerful lines with cardboard microphones. Grandmothers on Facebook reposted the veteran's salute with captions like, "Finally, someone spoke for us." Outside the forum, reporters lined up like a wall at every exit. Patel slipped out a side door, sunglasses on, head down. His aide whispered, "We need a statement now." Kash muttered, shaking, "Tell them Denzel twisted my words." But it was far too late. The aide's inbox was already flooded, with more leaked contracts, more auto pen approvals, and more names. Inside, Denzel stayed composed. He quietly thanked the staff, then hugged a shaking intern backstage and whispered, "Truth first, then healing." As he exited toward his vehicle, strangers across the barricades began to shout, "We believe you, Denzel. Thank you for speaking for us." The nation awakens. Denzel's truth echoes beyond politics. And for all the unheard voices, the silent fathers, the exhausted mothers, the forgotten families, Denzel offered only 2 words: thank you. Later that night, his phone buzzed with a message from his son. "Proud of you, Dad. Mom would be too. You made the nation listen." A single tear welled in Denzel's eye. He rarely showed emotion publicly, but this time the cameras weren't rolling. This was real, raw, unscripted, and the country saw it. But the storm had only just begun. By 6 a.m., Capitol Hill was swarming. Reporters crowded the marble steps. Flashbulbs went off like lightning. The Ethics Committee had called for an emergency congressional briefing. Representative Carla Moore, a moderate Democrat, stood at the podium, visibly shaken. "If what's been revealed is true," she declared, "then this is not a scandal. It's a betrayal, a shame to every public servant who actually serves." She demanded a bipartisan inquiry as cameras zoomed in on her trembling hands. Across town, Kash Patel sat in a dimly lit hotel suite, screens muted, captions flashing. Ethics crisis. Did Patel forge presidential authority? His lawyer scrolled through documents, whispering. The signatures match the AutoPen timestamps perfectly. The metadata aligns. Kash stared blankly before muttering, I was just trying to protect the administration. Meanwhile, Denzel accepted an invitation to speak, not at a televised summit, but at a small community center in Virginia. No press, no stage lights, just folding chairs and local families. The Secret Service raised concerns, but Denzel insisted. People need comfort, not cameras. Online, his influence was already snowballing. Hashtags like #TruthByDenzel and #PatelExposed trended worldwide. Influencers wept on live streams, sharing personal stories of corruption, abuse, and cover-ups. Denzel had become more than a man. He was now a symbol, a mirror for a wounded nation. At noon, respected journalist Maria Vasquez sat across from him in a sunlit library. The room was quiet, intimate, historic. Why now? She asked softly. Denzel folded his hands. Because silence can become betrayal, he said. I love this country more than I love comfort or legacy or image. Maria gently slid a folder forward. Did you leak the documents? He shook his head. No, but truth finds its own path. It always does. Then, voice heavier, he added, I watched Patel smile beside a leader who clearly needed rest, not politics. That broke me. Elsewhere, Kash Patel sat alone, watching the interview, his jaw clenched. No lawyers, no aides, only the flickering glow of a headline. Denzel Washington, voice of a nation betrayed. When Maria asked if Denzel could forgive Kash, his reply was quiet. Forgiveness is easy. Trust is harder. Tears glistened in his eyes. So did the eyes of millions watching. The interview ended with Maria reaching over and gently squeezing Denzel's hand. That image was captured and shared across the world. Even longtime critics wiped away tears, because this wasn't about party lines anymore. It was about promises and the people they were broken on. Later that night, Denzel sat alone in his study when his phone buzzed again. I watched every second, came the voice of the former president. You didn't just defend yourself. You defended the truth. You made me proud. Denzel swallowed the rising emotion. I didn't do it for pride. I did it because I had to. There was a pause, then, Patel may still try to spin this, Denzel warned. He's got people willing to twist anything. I know, came the reply, but America saw who he really is yesterday, and more importantly, they saw you. Denzel ended the call quietly, then turned to his security team. Get me the names of every contractor tied to those forged deals, every single one. He wasn't finished, and neither was the truth. That same afternoon, a former White House staffer, Natalie Brooks, appeared on live TV, hands trembling, tears streaking her cheeks. I served under both administrations, she said. The world held its breath. The silence breaks wider. Truth begins to echo. I respected Kash Patel once, said Natalie Brooks, her voice trembling as she sat before a sea of microphones and flashing cameras. But what I saw over the past year, it broke me. She raised an old scratched USB stick. This contains memos, emails, direct orders, she explained. I was told to push through signatures, ignore missing approvals, and when something looked off, I was told to make it disappear. The room was stunned. A reporter asked the question, trembling on everyone's lips. Did Mr. Patel know? Natalie nodded slowly through tears. He didn't just know, she said. He allowed it. He gave the green light. Then looking directly into the camera, she added, Mr. Washington, thank you for speaking. I couldn't live with the silence anymore. Somewhere in the West Wing, Denzel watched, hand to his mouth, eyes moist, not because he felt victorious, but because someone else had found the strength to speak. Later that evening, a courier arrived at the residence. The envelope he handed over bore no sender, just one word on the front, sorry. Inside, a handwritten letter in unmistakable script. Dear Denzel, I said something I shouldn't have. I let resentment speak. You were right. I didn't protect the president. I pretended he was okay when he wasn't. I let people put papers in front of him, and I turned away. Maybe I became what I once feared. And maybe you became what I never understood. Brave. Denzel read the letter twice. His face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, just stillness. He folded the note, placed it in a drawer, and whispered, "It's not about me anymore." As the country tried to process the confession, a haunting story surfaced from Martha Delaney, a 74-year-old widow from Indiana. Holding a crumpled letter she wrote 2 years ago, she spoke through tears. "My husband served 41 years, a veteran. He died waiting on surgery they said was delayed because funding hadn't cleared." She paused, voice cracking. "And now I hear about fake contracts, about money sent overseas. He gave everything, and someone played with a pen like his life didn't matter." She wiped her eyes and concluded, "Then I saw Mr. Washington speak, and I cried for the first time in years. Not out of sadness, but because someone finally said what we were too afraid to say." The clip of her statement went viral within minutes. People who had never cared for politics suddenly leaned in. In the Oval Office, Denzel stood across from the president, a file in his hand. "I need you to read this," he said. "All of it." The document outlined the story of Catherine Weller, a government auditor who had raised red flags about signature discrepancies in high-level contracts. Days after her final email, she died in what officials labeled an accidental car crash. "She tried to stop it," Denzel said quietly. "She told her supervisor. She wrote it down. And then she was gone." That night, Denzel stood before hundreds at a candlelight vigil, broadcast live across several networks. He didn't name names. He didn't shout. "Catherine Weller wasn't a scandal. She was a patriot who deserved to come home," he said softly. A single tear trailed down his face, and he let it. Somewhere behind the closed doors, Kash Patel watched, hand over his mouth, unable to speak. Across the country, people gathered, not in protest, but in mourning. Veterans held folded flags. Nurses brought framed photos of lost patients. Families held signs reading, "Where did the money go?" Inside the residence, Denzel's son looked up at him and said, "You're changing everything, Dad." Denzel smiled faintly. "No, son, the truth is." Meanwhile, Patel's former staffers began to turn. Leaked emails showed confusion, panic, and infighting. One chilling line surfaced from a frantic thread. "He never told us Denzel had proof." The nation's children began to speak. As the country reeled from wave after wave of revelations, a new anonymous leak appeared online, another forged contract. This one, a pharmaceutical deal worth nearly $1 billion, had been auto-signed while President Biden was sedated during a medical procedure. The reaction wasn't just political anymore. It had become deeply personal. In Kansas City, a 10-year-old boy named Matthew sat at his desk, quietly drawing. He sketched an American flag beside a stick figure labeled Dad, tears sliding down his cheeks. His teacher knelt beside him and asked gently, "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Matthew nodded, then whispered, "They said my dad died for freedom, but they lied to him." That night, Matthew's mother, a military widow, shared his drawing online with the caption, "My son lost his father in Afghanistan. We waited months for help from the government. Now we know why it never came. Those fake contracts, they stole time, and we never got it back." Somewhere in the residence, Denzel Washington saw the post. He read it twice, then sat quietly at his desk, tears glistening in his eyes. He didn't speak for several minutes. Then he turned to an aide and said, "Get me that boy's school. I want to write to him personally." What began as a scandal had become something else. Denzel wasn't revealing contracts anymore. He was unearthing broken hearts. Letters flooded in, photos, unpaid hospital bills, unanswered calls for help. And across those pages, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about corruption. It was about abandonment. By dawn, Kash Patel's team announced he would speak at noon, not in a defense, but in what they called a moment of clarity. At the podium, Kash's hands visibly shook. He stared at the cameras and began, "I let pride speak instead of humility. I mocked a man who didn't deserve it, and I stood by while things happened behind closed doors that never should have. When asked if he had used the auto pen with knowledge, he hesitated, then closed his eyes and said, "Yes," he added, "but I wasn't the only one. There were others stronger than me. They convinced me it was necessary, that the president would have approved. Maybe I wanted to believe that." He looked directly into the lens. I'm sorry, Denzel. I mocked your strength when in truth, I never had your kind of courage." Watching from a quiet room, Denzel simply whispered, "Now the healing can begin." That evening, Denzel returned to the same stage where this all began. The crowd was larger now, standing room only, but the room was quiet, heavy, expectant. He stepped to the mic, looked out at their faces and began, "I never wanted this to be about revenge. I only wanted the truth to matter again." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "Some say I'm just an actor, just a man with a script and a voice. But this seat right here," he motioned toward an empty chair beside him on stage, "this is for every mother who waited, every father who died confused, every child who drew a flag beside a stick figure named Dad." A hush fell, then a wave of quiet sobs. Denzel's voice steadied. "I am not a puppet. I am a man who watched silence destroy too many lives. And tonight, that silence ends." The crowd rose in emotional applause, not in celebration, but in release. It was as if America finally exhaled. That same night, a nurse named Elena stayed after her hospital shift to finish charting. A colleague showed her the video of Denzel's speech. The image of the empty chair stopped her cold. She sat on a supply cart, her hands shaking. Her father had been a veteran. He died during the pandemic after being promised care that never came. She wept, not for what was said, but for what was finally heard. Later, she pinned a note to the break room wall. "Thank you, Denzel. I can finally cry for him now. I'm not alone anymore." By morning, 10 more notes had joined it. A wall of grief was becoming a wall of healing, and as the day faded, Denzel returned to his residence. On his pillow lay a handwritten note from his son. "Dear Dad, I never knew everything you carried. I thought you just stood tall and talked like heroes do in movies. But tonight I saw the world cry with you. And now I understand why. You didn't just defend yourself. You stood up for everyone who couldn't. I'm proud of you." Denzel held the note with trembling fingers. And for once, he didn't hold back the tears. Because tonight, the nation hadn't just seen a man speak. They had felt their own stories rise through him. From exposure to action, Denzel carries the nation's burden. And when people say the name Washington, I hope they remember you first. Denzel sat in silence, holding his son's letter with trembling fingers. Not out of pride, not because he had won, but because he now fully grasped the weight of what he carried. Not for legacy, but for families, children, and truth. Just before dawn, a private courier arrived at the residence. In his hand, a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a classified internal memo from a liberal think tank, dated 2023. Title, Operation Guardian Pen, Signature Authorization for Strategic Influence. The contents were explosive, 5 names, among them, not only Kash Patel, but a respected progressive senator, long admired for his speeches about justice, equity, and protecting the vulnerable. Denzel read the senator's name aloud. His voice cracked. Him? This wasn't just a lone betrayal, it was a system, gambling with the lives of veterans and children in exchange for control. Denzel immediately picked up the phone. He called dozens of families, the same ones who had written him, shared their pain, wept in silence. I want to meet you, all of you, tonight. By 6 p.m., the East Room of the White House was transformed. No lights, no red carpet, just folding chairs, wheelchairs, factory workers, widows, nurses, families holding photos, people holding pain. Denzel didn't stand at a podium. He didn't lecture. He sat among them. He listened. One father held up a photo of his autistic son. They cut his therapy, he said. Said funds were reallocated, like my son's future didn't matter. A mother clutched the flag from her husband's funeral. He died serving this country, and someone signed away what he was owed, with a pen held by a man who was barely conscious. The room wept, not in weakness, but in unity. Afterward, Denzel stepped into a side room to breathe. His phone rang. "Unknown number," he answered. "You have no idea what you're stirring up," said the voice of the senator named in the Guardian pen memo. Denzel's voice was calm. "I think I do, and so does America." The senator scoffed. "Expose me, and it'll break the country further." Denzel didn't flinch. The country was already broken the moment you sold out its people. Others will fall too. People you've worked with, people you trust. Then they were already broken. I'm not protecting corruption just because it wore a friendly face. Outside, the White House lawn was glowing, but not from protests, from candles. People gathered to pray, to heal. Some held signs that read, "We believe Denzel." Truth matters. At 9 p.m., every major network cut to a surprise White House broadcast. The camera revealed Denzel standing alone at a plain table. No flags, no music. He looked into the lens. "3 days ago, I was called a fraud, a puppet. But what followed? Wasn't planned." He held up the Guardian pen memo. "This paper isn't just about politics. It's about power, stolen not from me, but from you, from your families, from your children, from your veterans." He placed the memo gently on the table. "This isn't revenge. This is responsibility." His gaze deepened. If you lost someone, if you felt forgotten, if you cried in silence while others smiled in wealth, this truth is for you. That sunrise, Harold Bishop, an 82-year-old Army veteran, laced up his boots and walked 2 miles to the state capitol using a cane. In his hand, a cardboard sign. "Thank you, Denzel." Drivers honked. One woman live-streamed his walk, saying he lost his pension in one of those fraudulent contracts. He didn't riot, he prayed, and someone finally heard him. By noon, a photo of Harold saluting on the Capitol steps went viral, his right hand raised, his left holding the sign. Elsewhere, Kash Patel stood in the back garden of his home, eyes on the wind moving through the trees. His aide approached. "Should we prepare a counter-statement?" Kash shook his head slowly. "Cancel everything." The aide blinked. "Should we at least respond to Denzel's speech?" Kash stared out into the dusk. "What would I even say?" His voice was barely a whisper. "The truth is already out." The resolution, truth is not just spoken, it's lived. "I'm not going on TV again." Kash Patel sat in silence beneath the trees of his private garden. His aide hesitated before asking, "Should we at least respond to Denzel's broadcast?" Kash shook his head slowly. "What would I even say?" he whispered. "The truth is already out." As the wind moved through the branches, Kash reflected aloud, "I thought I was protecting the system, keeping things together. But maybe I was just protecting power. My power." He swallowed hard. "I underestimated him. I saw a quiet man and thought he was weak. But Denzel is the strongest one of all." Inside the White House, the mailroom was overflowing. Letters from all 50 states, handwritten notes, veterans, nurses, teachers. One child's crayon drawing showed Denzel as a superhero with a caption, "Thank you for fighting for my mom. We lost our house, but now I know it wasn't her fault." A letter from a prison inmate read, "I made mistakes, but I've never cried watching anyone speak from the White House. You reminded me that truth still matters." Denzel read each letter, not as flattery, not as fandom, but as evidence of wounds a nation had hidden too long. The next morning, Congress convened for an emergency session. The motion on the floor, the first Citizen Truth Act, a bill outlawing covert auto pen authorizations and mandating transparent executive approvals. Outside, Harold Bishop, cane in hand, made his way up the Capitol steps. Denzel saw him from afar and left his security detail to walk beside him. "I came to say thank you," Harold whispered. Denzel took his elbow gently and replied, voice soft but proud, "It's my honor, sir." Inside the chamber, senators rose one by one to co-sponsor the bill. Then a moment no one expected. The once beloved progressive senator, named in the Guardian pen memo, stood. "I'm not here to defend myself," he began. "I'm here to face what I helped cause." He recounted late-night meetings, moral compromises, decisions justified in silence. "We stole time. We robbed families, and I am ashamed." He paused, emotion overtaking him. "I will vote yes on the Truth Act, and then I will resign." Stunned silence filled the chamber. Then, slow, steady applause. Back at home, Kash Patel sat alone and opened his laptop. He typed a single line to Denzel: "I'm ready to testify publicly." 3 nights after the clash that had started it all, people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, candles in hand, signs reading names, no chants, no anger, just presence. Denzel stood before them. He read aloud: "Catherine Weller, Matthew's dad, Harold's pension brothers." With each name, candles lifted into the night. "Tonight," Denzel said, "we remember pain, but we also reclaim promise." His voice was steady. "Truth may wound, but it also heals, and healing belongs to all of us." He lifted his candle high. Thousands followed. The Lincoln Memorial glowed like a lighthouse of resolve. In that golden hush, America breathed again. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Share it with someone who's still waiting for their truth to be heard. Because one person standing for what's right can inspire millions to find their voice. Your voice matters. Your integrity matters. And together we can build a nation where truth outweighs politics. God bless you, and God bless America.